For years after our divorce, my ex-wife begged for a second chance. Then she saw who opened my front door. I knew something had shifted the moment Melissa asked me to meet her at the Marina restaurant on a Wednesday afternoon. Because Melissa despised that place. She always said the parking lot smelled like diesel and the service was too slow for a lunch break. So when I walked in and found her already seated at a corner table, sunglasses pushed up into her hair even though we were indoors, I understood this wasn't going to be an ordinary conversation. She had a glass of white wine in front of her that she hadn't touched, and her fingers kept tracing the stem without lifting it. I sat down across from her, set my phone face down on the table, and asked what was going on. She told me she'd been under a lot of pressure at work lately, that her new supervisor had piled on extra travel, and that the stress was affecting her sleep. It sounded reasonable enough on its own. But there was a small detail buried in what she said that didn't line up. She mentioned a work trip to Denver the previous weekend. Except I remembered clearly that her company's Denver office had closed 18 months earlier during a round of layoffs I'd heard about from her own coworker at a barbecue. I filed that away instead of confronting her right there, because something told me the moment wasn't right yet, and because some part of me still wanted to believe the version of her that deflected blame onto exhaustion and burnout rather than anything else. She reached across the table, touched my hand, and said she just needed us to talk more, to reconnect, and I nodded along, telling myself that marriages go through rough patches and this was ours. Driving home that evening, I couldn't stop turning over the last several months in my head, and once I actually let myself look, the pattern arranged itself with uncomfortable clarity. Melissa had started locking her phone with a code instead of her thumbprint around the same time she claimed her fingerprint sensor stopped working, which never got fixed despite 3 trips to the store. According to her, she'd taken up a 6 a.m. spin class that somehow required a full face of makeup and a new gym bag every other week. She'd stopped wearing the bracelet I'd given her for our 8th anniversary, saying it kept catching on her sleeves at work, yet she wore it constantly whenever her sister visited. She'd become oddly secretive about a girls' trip to Charleston with a friend named Diane, a friend I had never once met in 6 years of marriage despite Melissa supposedly having known her since college. She flinched now whenever my phone buzzed near hers, as if any incoming notification might somehow implicate her. Individually, I could have waved off each of these. Together, laid out like that in my head on the drive home, they formed something I couldn't unsee, and once you see a pattern like that, you cannot make yourself unsee it again, no matter how much easier it might be to keep pretending. The confirmation came 3 weeks later, and it wasn't subtle or ambiguous in the way I might have imagined a discovery would be. I'd gone to pick up Melissa's car from the dealership after a scheduled oil change, since mine was in the shop that day, and the service advisor handed me a folder of paperwork along with her keys. Tucked inside the glove box, where I'd reached to grab the registration the advisor asked me to confirm, was a second phone I didn't recognize, a cheap prepaid one, still holding a charge, unlocked because she likely never expected anyone else to open that particular glove box. The messages on it went back for months. A man named Derek Whitfield, a name I'd never heard her mention once at any dinner, any holiday, any casual conversation about her office. The messages weren't ambiguous. They referenced a hotel near the airport, referenced feelings that had apparently existed long before the trip to Charleston, referenced how much easier things would be once Melissa figured out what she wanted to do about Daniel. That was me. I sat in the dealership parking lot for 11 minutes without starting the engine, scrolling through months of a life she'd built alongside the one she still came home to every night, the one where she still let me kiss her forehead before bed and still complained about parking lots smelling like diesel and still asked what I wanted for dinner as if nothing at all had changed. I didn't confront her that night, and I didn't confront her the next morning either. Instead, I did something that surprised even me in its coldness. I started documenting everything with the same discipline I used at work, where I ran a small architecture firm and had built my entire career on not missing details. I photographed every message on that second phone before returning it exactly where I'd found it, screenshot by screenshot, timestamp by timestamp. I pulled our joint bank statements and found charges to a boutique hotel chain that Melissa had explained away months earlier as a work conference reimbursement, except her employer's expense records, which I had access to through a shared cloud drive we'd set up years earlier for tax purposes, showed no such conference had ever been booked. I contacted a family law attorney named Diane Walsh, not to file anything yet, but to understand exactly what my rights were and how quickly I needed to move before Melissa realized I knew. Diane told me something I never forgot. The person who moves first, calmly and with documentation, almost always keeps more than the person who reacts emotionally in the moment. So I decided to become that first person, and I decided to do it without giving Melissa a single clue that anything had changed on my end. Over the following 2 weeks, I quietly separated everything that could be separated without alerting her. I moved half of our joint savings into an account solely in my name, a completely legal step my attorney assured me was standard practice during separation proceedings, and one Melissa would have done herself in a heartbeat if our positions were reversed. I changed the passwords on the accounts that were mine alone. I made copies of every financial document in the house and stored them off-site at my business partner's office. I kept behaving exactly the same at home, still asking about her day, still eating dinner across from her at our kitchen table, still letting her believe she had successfully hidden an affair from a husband too naive or too distracted to notice. The performance cost me more than I expected. There were nights I lay awake next to her, listening to her breathe evenly in her sleep, wondering how she managed to feel so at peace with the amount of deception she was carrying. But I reminded myself that peace built on someone else's ignorance isn't peace at all. It's just borrowed time, and hers was about to run out. I finally sat her down on a Sunday morning, coffee still steaming on the table between us, and told her I knew everything. I didn't yell. I didn't accuse her in fragments the way people do in movies, giving her room to talk her way around each individual piece of evidence. I laid it all out at once: the prepaid phone, the messages, Derek Whitfield's name, the hotel charges, the fabricated Denver trip, the Charleston trip that was never really about Diane at all. Melissa's face went through several stages in the span of about 10 seconds. Confusion, because she hadn't expected me to have specifics. Anger, because she assumed I'd invaded her privacy somehow, as if the privacy of an affair deserved protection. And finally something closer to relief, because she no longer had to keep performing a marriage she'd already left in every way that mattered. She admitted it. She told me it had started as something small and had turned into something she couldn't stop herself from wanting. She said she still cared about me, that this wasn't really about me being inadequate, that sometimes people just grow apart even while sleeping in the same bed every night. I told her I didn't need her explanation to feel real to me anymore, because nothing she said from that point forward could undo what I'd already seen with my own eyes on a phone she thought no one would ever find. The weeks that followed turned the house we'd shared for 6 years into something closer to a legal battlefield than a home. Melissa moved into a rental unit near her office, and I stayed in the house we'd bought together, the one I had personally designed half the renovations for, including the kitchen she used to brag about at dinner parties. Her attorney, a smooth-talking man named Gregory Hale, tried to open negotiations by suggesting Melissa receive spousal support for at least 18 months while she found her footing post-divorce, framing the entire failure of the marriage in vague, mutual terms, as though infidelity were simply one more symptom of two people drifting apart rather than the specific, documented choice one of them had made. My attorney, Diane Walsh, wasn't having any of that. She laid the evidence out during mediation with the same clinical precision I'd used to gather it: the phone records, the hotel charges, the fabricated business trips, months of a parallel relationship conducted while Melissa continued accepting my financial support without hesitation. Gregory tried to argue that the affair was irrelevant to asset division in our state, and legally he wasn't entirely wrong, but the mediator, an older man named Harold Simmons who had clearly seen every version of this story before, made it plain that Melissa's documented deception regarding shared finances, specifically using joint funds to finance a relationship she'd hidden from me, did in fact affect how those funds would be treated moving forward. By the end of that session, I retained the house outright, along with the majority of our joint investment accounts, while Melissa left with her personal assets and a settlement far smaller than what Gregory had originally proposed. She looked at me across that conference table like she still couldn't quite believe the version of me sitting there, calm and unshaken, was the same man she'd been married to for 6 years. The 4 years after the divorce were, without exaggeration, the best sustained stretch of my adult life, though it didn't feel that way in the beginning. The first several months were quiet in an unsettling way, the kind of silence that fills a house built for two people once one of them leaves it. I threw myself into the firm, taking on projects I would have hesitated to accept before, restructuring the partnership so my name carried more weight on new contracts, and within 2 years our client list had nearly tripled. I renovated the house again, this time with no one to argue with about paint colors or cabinet finishes, and it finally looked the way I'd always imagined it could. I started running again, something Melissa used to complain took time away from her, and I found I had plenty of time for it now that no one was keeping score of how I spent my evenings. Somewhere in that second year, I reconnected with Vanessa Reyes at an industry fundraiser my business partner dragged me to, one of those events with a silent auction and mediocre catering that I normally would have skipped entirely. Vanessa and I had actually crossed paths years earlier, back when she and Melissa were still close, before whatever falling out eventually pulled them apart around the time of the divorce. I hadn't recognized her immediately, only that she seemed familiar, standing near the auction tables arguing calmly, but firmly with an event coordinator about a mislabeled item, unbothered by the small crowd that had gathered to watch. There was something in the way she handled the disagreement, direct, unbothered, entirely without theater, that reminded me how much I'd missed being around people who didn't require constant management. We talked for over an hour that night, and somewhere in that conversation she mentioned, almost as an aside, that she and Melissa hadn't spoken in nearly 2 years, ever since Vanessa found out what Melissa had actually done during our marriage and told her, in no uncertain terms, exactly what she thought of it. That detail didn't fully register with me until much later, how deliberately Vanessa had distanced herself from someone she'd once considered a close friend, simply because she couldn't reconcile the version of Melissa who'd done that to me with the friendship they'd built over a decade. Vanessa and I took things slowly at first, both of us cautious in the particular way people become after watching relationships fail in front of them. But slow turned into steady, and steady turned into something that felt, for the first time since before my marriage even started, uncomplicated. She moved into the house a little over a year after that fundraiser, and the transition felt less like blending 2 separate lives and more like finally exhaling after years of holding a breath I hadn't realized I was still holding. She redecorated the guest room into a proper office for her freelance design work, put her own plants on the back patio, adjusted the thermostat to a temperature I actually preferred over the one Melissa always insisted on. The house, for the first time in years, felt like it belonged entirely to the people living in it rather than to the ghost of who used to. I heard occasional updates about Melissa through mutual acquaintances over those 4 years, the way you inevitably do in a town where everyone still knows everyone, even after a divorce scatters people into separate social circles. She'd left her old job within a year of the divorce, reportedly after her relationship with Derek Whitfield collapsed almost as quickly as it had started. Once the novelty of secrecy wore off and there was nothing left underneath it to sustain a real relationship. She moved twice that I knew of, once to a smaller apartment across town and again, later, to a rental unit 2 counties over, closer to her sister. Someone mentioned she'd tried dating again but that it never seemed to stick, and someone else mentioned she'd started telling a slightly different version of our marriages ending to different people. One where she framed herself as the one who'd been trapped, misunderstood, or emotionally starved, depending on the audience. I didn't spend much energy thinking about any of it. I had built something steady and real with Vanessa, and the version of me that used to lie awake analyzing Melissa's every inconsistency belonged to a chapter of my life I'd already closed. Then, almost exactly 4 years to the month after that Sunday morning conversation over coffee, Melissa showed up at my front door on a Thursday evening in early autumn, unannounced, her car parked awkwardly along the curb like she'd second-guessed pulling into the driveway itself. I saw her through the front window before she rang the bell, and for a moment I genuinely considered not answering at all. But curiosity, or maybe just the instinct to finish something properly instead of leaving it hanging, pulled me toward the door. She looked different in ways that were hard to pin down exactly, thinner, tired around the eyes, dressed more plainly than the version of her I remembered, who used to spend an hour deciding what to wear to the grocery store. She told me she'd been doing a lot of thinking over the past year, that therapy had helped her understand some things about herself she hadn't been able to see clearly at the time, that she recognized now what she'd thrown away and how badly she'd handled it, and that she wanted to know if there was any part of me still capable of considering a second chance. She said all of this quickly, almost rehearsed, like she'd practiced the exact sequence of sentences in her car before working up the nerve to walk up the path. I was still standing in the doorway, letting her finish, when I heard footsteps behind me in the hallway, and Vanessa appeared at my shoulder, dish towel still in her hand from dinner prep, asking calmly whether everything was all right out front. The moment Melissa's eyes landed on her, something in her expression collapsed entirely, faster and more completely than anything I'd said to her in the 4 years since our divorce had managed to do. She looked from Vanessa to me and back again, and I watched her piece together, in real time, exactly who had been standing on the other side of my front door for the past several years while she'd been rebuilding her life 2 counties away, unaware. Vanessa, for her part, didn't flinch, didn't raise her voice, didn't need to say anything cutting to make the moment land the way it did. She simply asked, in the same even tone she used for everything, whether Melissa would like to come in or whether this conversation was finished, because dinner was getting cold. Melissa stood frozen on the top step for what felt like a long stretch of silence, staring at the one person she likely never imagined would end up standing in that doorway beside me. The friend she'd confided in for years before the affair, the friend who'd known exactly what Melissa had done and had chosen, deliberately and without ambiguity, to walk away from that friendship rather than pretend it hadn't mattered. Melissa finally looked back at me, some mixture of humiliation and disbelief still settling into her face, and asked, quietly, how long this had been going on, as though the specific timeline somehow mattered more than the fact of it. I told her the timeline wasn't really her business anymore, that she'd forfeited the right to ask me questions like that the day I found a second phone in her glove box, and that whatever she'd hoped to reclaim by showing up at my door that evening had already been gone long before she ever knocked. She didn't argue. She didn't raise her voice or try to salvage the moment with the kind of speech she'd clearly prepared on the drive over. She just looked past me one last time, toward the warm light spilling out of the kitchen, toward the life that had continued fully and completely without her, and something in her posture finally seemed to accept that no amount of reflection or apology was going to reopen a door that had been closed for years already, long before she ever worked up the courage to knock on it. She turned, walked back down the path to her car, and drove away without looking back, the same way I imagined she must have driven away from a dozen other consequences in her life, hoping that not looking back might somehow soften what she was leaving behind. Vanessa closed the door gently once Melissa's taillights disappeared down the street, and asked if I was all right. I told her I was better than all right, that I felt something close to relief, the kind that only comes from watching a door close on a version of your life you'd already finished grieving long before the person on the other side of it ever showed up asking for it back. We ate dinner that night at the same kitchen table where Melissa and I used to sit in tense, unspoken silence during those final weeks of our marriage, except this time the silence between Vanessa and me was the comfortable kind, the kind that doesn't need filling. Somewhere outside, the streetlights came on along the block, and the house settled into the particular quiet that belongs only to people who've stopped waiting for anything to go wrong. For years earlier, I had sat across from a woman who called stability boring and predictability a flaw. Now I understood that what she'd actually been describing without realizing it was peace. The exact thing she'd traded away, and the exact thing that had been sitting quietly behind my front door the entire time she was out looking for something better.